everyone, and welcome to the 2022 Constitution Day lecture at Belmont College. My name is Dr. Pious Aeneas. I'd like to get out every single person in the room. Thank you for coming. So, we celebrate Constitution Day every year. This is the 244th anniversary, or tomorrow, of the signing of the Constitution of the United States. In Philadelphia, by 39 men, out of the 55 delegates from 12 American states that came. And it's sort of an odd holiday in the way we celebrate it. It's kind of odd. Because the 4th of July, which is the birthday that most people think of, although it's been challenged, most people don't actually talk about it, that talk. In 1776, another birthday, which was 1690, or Tocqueville, like 1620, we were talking actually about students about various beginnings of the end for the West. Well, the beginning of the end, but there's always an interesting and fruitful conversation about what that might be. But also an interesting and fruitful conversation about what day America begins. So at least one thing in the September 1787. But we don't celebrate it with lots of, which is what you would do about to celebrate the beginning of me. We're talking about end of 4 months of deliberation about this public document that comes to be. So we typically celebrate it with lectures and talks and roundtables and debates. Why would we do this? Well, I think, as I argue, that every intro to American government or American Constitution syllabus should begin with this quote by Alexander Hamilton from Federalist 1, and I think I read it last year, so you can say, get some new material, Wysocki, but it's important. In Federalist 1, right, when they're about to begin debating the ratification that comes after September 17th, Alexander Hamilton says the following: "The crisis at which we are arrived may with propriety be regarded as the era in which that decision is to be made, a decision about whether or not men can rely on their reason and deliberation for creating their own constitutions, or if they are doomed forever to have their constitutions given to them by accident and choice." And he says, and in this view, our time deserves to be the decision, the crisis at which we arrive may with propriety be regarded as the era in which that decision is to be made, and a wrong election of the part we shall act may, in this view, deserve to be considered as the general misfortune of mankind. This idea will add the inducements of philanthropy to those of patriotism, to heighten the solicitude which all considerate and good men must feel for the event. Happy will it be if our choice should be directed by a judicious estimate of our true interests, unperplexed and unbiased by considerations not connected with the public good. But this is a thing, and this is an interesting line, this is a thing more ardently to be wished than seriously to be expected, that we could actually deliberate about our real interests in an unbiased way. Right? It innovates upon the plan offered to our deliberations affects too many particular interests, innovates upon too many local institutions, not to involve in its discussion a variety of objects foreign to its merits, and of views, passions, and prejudices little favorable to the discovery of truth. So he doesn't have a whole lot of hope here for the possibility that we can talk about this thing in a rational way. And then he goes on, along with James Madison and John Jay, for 85 papers to try to make rational arguments to persuade his countrymen that this document is worth ratifying. But I think the point he makes here, this question about whether or not this experiment in self-government can succeed, is an open question today. And so we come back to this every year, and we reopen this question about the Constitution and about self-government. Dr. Hansen is going to be talking about George Washington, and her talk is called George Washington and the Virtue of Patriotism. George Washington was at the Constitutional Convention. I think he only spoke once, right? He spoke once, of course, as the first president of the United States, and is a supporter of the Constitution. And although not belonging to a particular political party, is sometimes lumped in with the Federalists. And so why on Constitution Day would we talk about George Washington? And I just want to offer one last remark before I turn it over to Dr. Hansen and introduce her. Alexis de Tocqueville, haha. No. I've been pondering this a lot lately. When he talks about the Federalists, and he has Washington in mind here, says this odd thing about the Constitution. He says, America is the land of democracy, so the Federalists were always a minority, but they counted in their ranks nearly all the great men who had emerged from the War of Independence, and their moral power was very extensive. Circumstances, moreover, favored them. The ruin of the First Confederation made the people afraid of falling into anarchy, and the Federalists profited from this temporary frame of mind. For 10 or 12 years, by which I think he means the presidencies of Washington and Adams, they led affairs and were able to apply, if not all of their principles, some of them. For day by day, the opposing current, the Jeffersonians, became too violent for anyone dare to struggle against it. But, so the Constitution and the Federalists were sort of at odds with their time and with the American ethos. It's an odd thing to say, right? But he also says this, the transitional period when the Federalists held power is, in my opinion, one of the most fortunate events that accompanied the birth of the great American Union. The Federalists struggled against the irresistible inclination of their country. Their theories, however excellent or flawed, had the fault of being inapplicable to the whole society. This is why the Jeffersons were bound to win sooner or later. But at least their government let the new republic have time to get established and allowed it afterward to bear without difficulty the rapid development of the doctrines they had, for which they had fought. A great number of their principles ended up, moreover, being accepted into the creed of their adversaries, and the federal Constitution, which still continues to exist in our time, is a lasting monument to their patriotism and wisdom. And so, with Dr. Susan Hansen's talk here about Washington's patriotism and that being tied to the Constitution, I'd like to introduce her now. Oh, I should first thank, very importantly, I forgot to do this, very importantly, thanking the Jack Miller Center for the generous support of this event. Dr. Susan Hansen is an associate professor of history at the University of Dallas, where she has taught American civilization on the Dallas campus and Western civilization on the Rome campus for 20 years. She publishes in British and American intellectual history, particularly in religious and national identity. She has also taught for the James Madison Memorial Fellowship at Georgetown University and the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University. We're incredibly grateful to have her here. She just had a wonderful talk with some of our students upstairs, and we are delighted to have her now for her talk. Thank you.
George Washington was a silent, presiding presence at the Constitutional Convention. And he is still a silent, presiding presence in our capital in Washington, D.C. The Washington Monument is the largest obelisk on planet Earth. University of Dallas students who all go to study in Rome become pretty obsessed with obelisks because you can find your way around Rome by just going from obelisk to obelisk, right? There's this piazza with an obelisk, and then you head that direction up, to the next piazza with an obelisk, and then to the next piazza with an obelisk over, Piazza del Popolo, Piazza Navona, the piazza in front of Santa Maria Maggiore. Everybody has an obelisk, right? There are more obelisks in Rome today than there are in Egypt because the Roman emperors stole all of the Egyptian obelisks. So we have a kind of obelisk fetish at the University of Dallas. But the truth is that Rome does not have the largest obelisk on planet Earth. The United States of America has the largest obelisk on planet Earth, as Earth is spinning through the galaxy in the starry heavens. Sticking out of it is a very large white monument that took us over 100 years to build. The entire 19th century, we were working on funding, bringing in enough stones to build the Washington Monument. It wasn't finished until about 1884. Under Cleveland, I think it was inaugurated, President Cleveland. So I would like to speak about George Washington today in order to somehow explain the presence of that large white monument. We have been, for the past few years, in a kind of national tumult about national memorials and sculpture. And if there's one monument that would be very difficult to take down, that would be very difficult to implode, take a lot of dynamite, would be the Washington Monument. It would take more than a few ropes and a few poles to pull down the Washington Monument. And so I would like to invite all of you to revisit George Washington, to revisit the figure of George Washington. Sometimes we see him a little bit too much as the large white obelisk, the marble man, and we don't know enough about his political insides, right? What are the political innards, the political philosophy, the moral makeup of George Washington? Sometimes we think we know more about Thomas Jefferson's political philosophy. We feel like we know more about the very verbose and choleric John Adams, or that we know more about Benjamin Franklin because of his autobiography. But for George Washington, we don't have much of a personal portrait of George Washington because his wife, Martha Washington, burned all of his letters. And the people at Mount Vernon, the Washington Society at Mount Vernon, at his home, obsess over the fact that we don't have any of his letters because Martha Washington burned all of his personal letters. Right? So they have a documentary where they show Martha Washington throwing letter after letter after letter into the fire, destroying the possibility that we could know anything about George Washington's personal, private, inner life, right? They actually have a documentary, and that's pretty much all you watch through the entire half an hour is Martha Washington burning the letters. But there are ways of getting to know George Washington personally. We know that his favorite play was Joseph Addison's Cato, a tragedy, a story of Cato the Younger, who fought against Julius Caesar and ended up in North Africa, committing noble, honorable suicide rather than submitting to the tyranny of Julius Caesar. This was the blockbuster hit of the 18th century. It was everyone's favorite play. Everyone was quoting it. Every American founder quotes Joseph Addison's Cato at some point. In fact, we think of Patrick Henry saying, "Give me liberty or give me death." That's actually from Joseph Addison's Cato. We know the wonderful line, you know, I am sad that I only have one life to give for my country. It's a line borrowed from Joseph Addison's Cato. Joseph Addison's Cato was the Princess Bride of the 18th century, right? Everyone knew it, everyone quoted it. It was just a matter of quoting it at the perfect moment, right? This word, I do not think it means what you think it means, right? I mean, it's sort of like, you just got to kind of get the perfect line, right? George Washington first performed Joseph Addison's Cato when he was 14 years old. He had Joseph Addison's Cato performed at Valley Forge in order to enliven the spirits of his men after the first year of battle had given them orderly retreats after orderly retreats after orderly retreats. It's what George Washington did best, was the orderly retreat, right? It was called the Fabian strategy after the Roman Emperor Fabius, right? The orderly retreat so that you can live to fight another day. The whole goal is to keep an army in the field, not necessarily to win battles, but simply not to dissolve into a guerrilla force. So he loved Joseph Addison's Cato, performed in it many times from the time he was a teenager all the way into his 40s. We also know that he had in his library at Mount Vernon a copy of Cicero's book on duties. Marcus Tullius Cicero, another opponent of Julius Caesar, who fought against Julius Caesar so much that he had his head and his hands chopped off and displayed in the Forum for his resistance to the first triumvirate. Cicero's book on duties, or on offices, called De Officiis, Marcus Tullius Cicero's De Officiis, was familiarly known in its English translation in the 18th century as Tully's offices. And in the bibliography for Mount Vernon Library of all of George Washington's books, we know that he had a copy of Tully's offices, or Cicero's De Officiis, right? George Washington did not read Cicero in Latin. He did not read his Homer in Greek. He read them in translation, as I imagine you all are reading your classical and Christian great books, not in the original Greek and Latin, but you're reading them in English. Right? That means that you, like George Washington, are macaroni men. Macaroni is a mixture of pasta and cheese, I hope you realize. Macaroni is a mixture of pasta and cheese, which is the cure for the common cold, including COVID. Mac and cheese, right, a mixture, una mezcla, right, a mixture. And in the 18th century, they spoke a mixture language, a little bit of Latin and less Greek, a little bit of English and less Latin, which is probably what you have, right? Maybe not a little bit of Latin and less Greek, but a little bit of English and less Latin, right? They had their copies of Cicero's De Officiis with the Latin-English facing text. This is a macaroni copy. It's a mixture, mac and cheese, Latin and English on facing pages, right? Our legal language is macaronic. We refer to certain legal terms in Latin still, like stare decisis. We had a great debate this past summer over the Dobbs decision and the overturning of Roe v. Wade. And a lot of that decision, a lot of that debate took place over stare decisis, the question of whether you will stand by already decided cases, already standing decisions of the court. But we usually say that phrase in Latin. Habeas corpus, to have your body, right? Your right not to be arrested unless they have told you what you are being accused of. I hope you realize that you can't be just kidnapped and taken away as a hostage without being told what you're being accused of. If they're going to put handcuffs on you, you have a right to know what crime you are being accused of. That is the right of habeas corpus. We usually say it in Latin. So we spoke a macaroni legal language. They also had in the 18th century a lot of macaronic songs because they were in the process of translating a lot of Latin hymns into German, Latin hymns into French, Latin hymns into English, and any song that was only partially translated, and you would go back and forth from a Latin line into an English line, was called a macaronic hymn. It was still a mixture, right? Still a mixture of two languages. They usually described college students as having macaronic dress. You know, you get these sort of preppy New England Ivy League types. I think this is macaronic dress. Khakis and a button-down shirt is a mixture of casual and formal, right? And so you have a little bit of the khakis with the embroidered flamingos on them, right? Or the bow tie, right? It's a little bit posh, right? This is macaronic dress. This is, you know, that you were dressing dressing a little bit above your station, that you were starting to take on airs because you had read the classics. You were starting to speak with a fake British accent, right? This was macaronic, right? So George Washington, he never went to university. He did not know Greek or Latin. He read his Greek and Latin in translation, which made him the ultimate macaronic man, right? And so he is the epitome of Yankee Doodle went to town riding on a pony, stuck a feather in his cap and called it macaroni. You thought that was a nonsense song. It is not a nonsense song. It is a description of the classical and Christian culture that formed the American founders in 1776. And George Washington is very much a statuesque embodiment of that macaroni culture. So tonight we're going to be sort of exploring George Washington's macaroni innards, right? This mixture of classical and Christian culture, a classical and Christian view of the human person that we find in George Washington. The order of the city reflects the order in man's soul. This is one of the oldest classical insights, right, into our human condition. We get it from reading Plato's Republic, first thing at the beginning of the curriculum, right? That the order of the city reflects the order of man's soul. If there is disorder in the city, the disorder in the city tends to infect the order of your soul. And if there's disorder in your city, then that tends to overflow order in the city. And so there's a symbiotic relationship between the order in the city and the order in the city of man's soul. And a central part of our civilizational crisis today, in the 2020s, is the inner collapse of patriotism. Patriotism in the city and patriotism in the soul. As a historian at the University of Dallas for the past 20 years, I have been teaching, as Professor Wysocki mentioned, I have been teaching American civilization on our Dallas campus in Texas, the great state land of the free. If you ever need freedom, come on out. They're going to take away our freedom only from our cold, dead hands, right? But in the summers, I'm able to go to the University of Dallas Rome campus and teach Western civilization. We have a campus just outside of Rome. It's an old patrician villa. The well in our vineyard, where we make our own wine, is called the Due Santi Well by the people in that area, because there's the legend going back from the beginning of the Christian era that both Peter and Paul stopped to use that well on the Via Appia as they traveled to Rome. And so I have this kind of idyllic life where I'm able to both study American civilization and Western civilization, right? Back and forth, kind of looking at the relationship between the American city and the West, the civilization in which America grew up. And so I try to teach my students a kind of capacious, informed patriotism. We try to do justice to the American founding, try to do justice to the American Civil War, try to do justice to the greatest generation. It's not your generation. I've run into that mistake occasionally with my students. They think they are the greatest generation. Sorry, but the greatest generation lived through the Depression, landed on the beaches of Normandy, liberated the death camps, and came home and built superpower America in the 1950s. That was the greatest generation. So we try to do justice to American civilization and to American patriotism, but we also try to teach students a broader, richer, deeper, capacious patriotism towards Western civilization, towards Christian culture. I have been very much influenced by the work of Russell Kirk, the great classic text, 1974 text by Russell Kirk, called Roots of the American Order. It was an important book in the creation of the modern conservative movement that led to the Reagan Revolution in 1980, largest Republican victories in American history. It was part of the creation of a conservative intellectual movement. And Russell Kirk is convinced that America is not brand new, that the ideas of the American Declaration of Independence, that the ideas about checks and balances and separation of powers that we find in the Constitution are not modern ideas, that American civilization is profoundly rooted in Western civilization. He argues in that book that America is rooted in 4 different cultural heritage cities: Jerusalem, Athens, Rome, and London. That in order to understand America, you need to understand the moral tradition of Jerusalem, the intellectual tradition of Athens, the political tradition of Rome, and the educational tradition of London, of the high medieval university, right, which was copied in the American colonies, in our original colleges and universities. And so it's a very good argument for realizing that when Americans go to Europe, when our students go to our Rome campus, they're not studying abroad. We do not have a study abroad program. We are not trying to immerse you in a foreign culture. We're trying to send you home to the deepest roots of American civilization. For anyone who has been formed in the Judeo-Christian, Greco-Roman culture that was the soil out of which America sprang, going to Jerusalem is not going abroad. Going to Athens is not going abroad. Going to Rome is to go home. To visit London is to visit the deep roots of our own culture. And this was Russell Kirk's insight in his book, Roots of the American Order. So at my university, and I hear at your university as well, you are sitting on a hill outside of a city. Right? And a hill outside of a city is the perfect place for a liberal arts education. To come away from the city for a little while. Come away for a little while to rest. You have 4 years of leisure in order to separate yourself from the busyness of the city and contemplate the order of the city. And what is the order of the city doing to the inner order of your own soul? We need to distance ourselves from the city, look at its traffic patterns, look at its immigration patterns, understand its commercial patterns, understand its intellectual underpinnings, its legal structure, understanding the executive branch and what is the health and the corruption of the executive branch, understanding the judiciary and the health and the corruption of the judicial branch, understanding the legislature and the health and corruption of the legislature, whether it is your local legislature, your city council, right, your state Supreme Court, or the United States Supreme Court and the United States Congress and executive bureaucracy. And as we contemplate the order of the city, we are also contemplating the inner order of our soul, because we also have an executive branch, a judicial branch, and the more democratic legislative branch inside of us. We have the intellect, the will, and the passions. And so we are invited to both look out to understand the city that forms us from without, but also to look inward, at the order of the city within us. And so from these vantage points, right, of a hill outside of the city, you have enough leisure before you dive into the city, right, before you dive into whatever your professional and familial and religious vocation is. You have a moment of leisure. The word school means leisure. Scola means leisure. It is what a free man does with his free time. He has the freedom to contemplate the order of the city and the order of the soul before he starts to act. The disorder that we have most recently witnessed in our cities, the frenzy of hatred for American statues and monuments, is indicative of a disorder in the soul. The central moral muscle, the central spiritual muscle of our inner physique has disappeared. This is the muscle of piety. The threefold piety to God, Father, and country. The central image of Western civilization has been the figure of Pious Aeneas. I just stepped into Professor Alyssa Torres's office for a moment. She was going to let me take a little break before my lecture, give me a glass of water. I sat down on her couch and glanced up and found myself looking at a poster of Pious Aeneas fleeing burning Troy with his father on his shoulders, who's holding the gods of the city, and at his heels, his son, Asconius. And I was like, oh, hello, Pious Aeneas. Fancy meeting you here, right? I guess we must be blood kin. You know, that we're definitely kindred spirits here, right? That you immediately meet Pious Aeneas, right? As Virgil presents Aeneas to us in his epic poem, the Aeneid, fleeing burning Troy, bringing his father and his son and the gods of his household in the city, he represents the spiritual strength of man, not the physical prowess on the battlefield, but the strength to shoulder the burden of the past. The strength to shoulder the burden of the past with all of its richness of tradition and all of its problematic heritage as well. To shoulder the burden of piety to those we depend on, and the burden of pity towards those who depend on us. El hombre con los hombros. In Spanish, it's a redundancy to say that a man has shoulders. The word man in Spanish is shoulders. Yo, shoulders. Yo, over here we need a pair of shoulders, right? If you're looking for a quick what is man to go with your what is woman, right? What is man? Shoulders. Like, I just need shoulders, right? El hombre tiene los hombros, right? Has shoulders, right? And so you see Pious Aeneas, right? Especially in Bernini's famous sculpture. Some of you may be Michelangelo people, some of you may be Bernini people. In every room, I think there's a division between those who love the Renaissance and Michelangelo's sculptures, the Pietà, the David, right? And those who love the Baroque and love Bernini's sculptures, his David, right? His Pious Aeneas, his Apollo and Daphne, his Rape of Persephone. So, you know, I'm sorry to those of you who prefer Michelangelo, right? But I'm going to try to get you to draw up on your mental screen the image of Pious Aeneas sculpted in marble in the round by Bernini, right? All of Bernini's famous sculptures are in the round, right? You have to walk around and around and around them, right? You go to the Villa Borghese in Rome, and there's like 4 rooms downstairs in the Villa Borghese, and there's 4 rooms upstairs in the Villa Borghese, and each one has a Bernini sculpture. And you walk around the Bernini sculpture for 20 minutes, and then you go to the next room and walk around another Bernini sculpture to see it from every possible angle, right? And so you get the twist of marble, almost like a DNA structure, right? A twist of marble, right? They had learned that twist of the torso from looking at ancient Greek sculptures, the Laocoon. The twist of the male torso, right? The twist of the agon, the agony of man, the spiritual struggle of man. You see this even in modern sculpture. Perhaps one of the most memorable modern sculptures that you can pull up on your mental screen is Rodin's The Thinker, which takes that twist of torso and turns it inwards, right? Where it's man's internal agony, the internal agony of thought, right? If you've ever experienced this, right, 3 a.m., you're working on a paper, right? You suddenly feel like the thinker. Like there's that sort of torso twist of agony as you try to, turn out 1,200 words, right? 1,200 words by tomorrow, right? How do they want me to footnote it? So you have this amazing twist of Aeneas's torso, right, as he shoulders his father and the gods of his fatherland, right? As he lifts up father, gods, and country, right? In a single movement, in a single twist, right? But there's a twist upwards, piety to God, father, and country, piety to those we depend on. There's also a twist downwards, because Asconius is following him with the hearth fire of their home, right? The gods of our hearth and home. What gods do you have at your hearth at home? Do you have a mantelpiece? Do you aspire to have a mantelpiece? What busts do you intend to put on your mantelpiece? We know Alyssa Torres has Pious Aeneas over her mantelpiece. What do you have on your mantelpiece, right? There's a twist downward to little Asconius, who's holding the hearth fire of the gods of Troy, right, following at his father's heels. And so the central muscle, the central moral muscle of man is pietas, piety upwards, pity downwards. Right? Piety is the highest form of justice. We tend to think that the highest form of justice is a kind of tit-for-tat, egalitarian, contractual exchange with another equal. But the highest form of justice is piety upwards towards those natural societies that we depend on because they brought us into this world, family, nation, and church. And pity downwards towards those who depend on us, the children, the elderly, the sick, the poor. These are the ligaments of society, religio, the ligaments, the ties that bind us together. Before any contractual ties, there are ties that are stronger than contract. And this was the insight of the Roman orator Cicero when he defined natural law. That the virtue of justice requires, first of all, first and foremost, love of God, love of country, and love of family. The nation, like the family and the church, is one of the natural communities that is constitutive of our human nature. I like to imagine 3 intersecting circles, a kind of Venn diagram, right? Circling around the person, converging on the person, family, nation, church. Everyone's got one. You can't be human without a family, a nation, or a church. Everyone in some way, shape, or form has one. We are deracinated cosmopolitan moderns, and we tend to imagine that we arrived on Earth as a lone individual, and that the only groups we belong to are the groups that we choose to belong to. Egalitarian, contractual, motivated by our own self-interest. But in reality, each person emerges from pre-existing communities. We are birthed forth from pre-existing communities. We come into the world already indebted and obligated for the very condition of our own existence. Man is a naturally social animal. I can already tell from having spent a mere afternoon here at Belmont Abbey that you are all very familiar with Aristotle and his dictum that man is a political animal. But it is Thomas Aquinas who always reminds us that man is a political and social animal, that before belonging to any political community, he belongs to communities that are antecedent to and prior in obligation to any state, man's obligations to family, nation, and church, his duty of filial piety, patriotism, and religious veneration arise from rational reflection on his own existential condition of dependence. Let us pause to bask in the light of this insight into the human condition. This is not a political ideology. It's not a description of how things should be or how things ought to be in a utopian, perfect world. This is political realism, taking into account the reality of human nature. Each of these communities, family, nation, church, is dominated by some non-negotiable relationship that every human person has. Looking first at the family. Every human person has a mother and a father. They may be estranged from their mother and father. They may have been conceived in a petri dish from an egg donor and a sperm bank. But somewhere, they have a mother and a father. And just as surely as every human person has a mother and a father, every human person has a here and a now, a time and a place, a birth date and a birthplace. It's not possible to be bodily reality without extension in space and time. And we all began our temporal spatial existence sometime, somewhere. Much as I would like to have lived in first century Palestine or 13th century France. I know some students who idealize 13th century France. I asked a student recently, would you prefer to live in America or communist China? And the response was, I would prefer 13th century France. It's not one of our options, right? That's just not one of our options. There is no way that I can escape from the reality that I was born in 1970s Chicago. It's not romantic, it's not Ireland, right? I don't know if you would say 1970s Chicago is a rich cultural soil, but it's the cultural soil I've got, right? Es la realidad, right? And it's important to live in reality rather than in fantasy. And the church. I know you're all thinking, yes, the church is different, right? Yes, I know I have a mother and a father. I know I have a place and a time. But surely churches are voluntary, optional groups that you join. In America, we tend to think that every little town has a main street, and Main Street crosses with Church Street. And on Church Street, you find the Episcopalian Church, the Presbyterian Church, the Methodist Church, the Baptist Church, the Church of Seventh-day Adventists, and the Catholic Church. And you can drive down, Church Street and decide which one you choose. I had a grandfather who wasn't Catholic, and whenever they took care of us while my mother was in the hospital having another baby, and he'd have to drive us to the Catholic Church on Sunday, he kept asking us, why don't we just stop in here? It's closer. Why don't we just stop in here? It's closer. Why don't we just stop in here? It's closer. Right? So we tend to think of the church as a voluntary association, that we choose a church. But the reality is that every human person has a relationship to all that is. The entire panoply of being, the cosmos, a particular unique relation to every original thought and every speck of stardust in the Milky Way. And thus, we have a relation to the first cause and the final cause of all that is, whatever you call that. We have a relationship with the why and the wherefore, the efficient cause and the telos, the alpha and the omega of all that is. Our relationship to any church is always a relationship of discernment. Which church we think has the best account of the divine, which church has the best form of worship of whatever we consider to be the alpha, the omega, the why, the wherefore, the beginning, the end of all that is. But everyone has such a relationship. These three sets of existential relations to a mother and a father, a time and a place, and a beginning and end of all things, delineate the three communities that are constitutive of our being: family, nation, and church. The older moral tradition referred to them simply as duties of piety to God, Father, and country. But I think that God, Father, and country are a little bit simplistic, because in reality, these are not simple relations. These are complex, multivalenced relations. The family relation is already immediately a twofold connection to both a mother and a father, through which we have relations with two sets of grandparents, four sets of grandparents, right? A spreading family tree becomes complex immediately, involving aunts and uncles and siblings and cousins. Right? The family relation ought better to be described as the familia relation, or even the familia relation in Italian. You add the G and it becomes more intense and intimate, right? The Italian family, you know you can't get out of an Italian family, right? There's no escaping a New Jersey Italian family, or an Italian family from Sicily, right? So extensive and intensive kinship networks, right? Ties of kith and kin to a whole clan. It is through the family relation that eventually we find ourselves related to the entirety of humanity. Not in an abstract sense, but in a very real sense. We are human because of our human parentage. The family is, in Aristotelian terms, the formal cause of our being. It is the cause of our taking the form of human, being a member of the human race. The nation is a similarly complex reality, encompassing both right of blood and right of soil, jus sanguinis and jus solis. You are an American if you are born of American parents anywhere in the world. You are an American if you are born on American soil of any parentage whatsoever. A nation is not a state or a political regime. A nation is something more organic, a mother tongue and a fatherland. Just as your familial relationship is complicated already by the fact that it's twofold, mother and father, you also have a complex relationship to your nation, your mother tongue, and your fatherland. The language in which you first described the landscape. Irving, Texas, University of Dallas, we're on a hill outside of a city. You're in Bellemonte, guess that's Italian. Outside of Charlotte, right? We're on a hill outside of Dallas, right? We describe our hill as Las Colinas. And in Spanish, you can diminutize a hill infinitely. It goes from a cola to a colina, to a colinita, to a colinitita, colinititita. Right? It gets smaller and smaller. You can do that in Spanish in a way that you can't do that in English, right? So the language in which you first described your landscape, right? It's a symbiotic relationship between time and place, language and culture. I have a Greek uncle. When my aunt studied abroad in Rome, she did what every family hopes won't happen when you study abroad in Rome. She met a long-haired, motorcycle-riding, card-carrying communist Greek and wanted to bring him home and marry him, which she did. That Greek uncle of mine fled Greece during the Greek Civil War when he was 7 years old. His parents sent him away to escape the communists who were exporting children to communist countries to be re-educated. And so they sent him abroad to live with his aunt and uncle when he was 7 years old. He left Greece when he was 7. He came to America in his 20s, and he's now in his 80s. He lived in Greece for 7 years. He's been living in America for 60 years, which is more than any of you who are native. 60 years he's been living in America. He has a thick Greek accent and can't understand living outside of the sight of mountains. Your patria, your mother tongue, your fatherland, right, shapes your soul, even if you choose a different country, even if you choose revolution and overturning the regime, right? You are nevertheless shaped in some fundamental way by where you came from. The land where your father spilled his seed and your mother shed her blood to bring you forth. Land where my fathers died, we say. We sing. Land where I was born. Maybe it's land where your grandparents are buried. Maybe for some people it's land where their child is buried. It gives us a connection to place and time. A loyalty, not a political allegiance to a regime, but a loyalty to language and land. Similarly, the church relationship is complex. One can have both a rational relationship with God the Father as cause of all that is. 18th century deists at the time of the American founding used to like to refer to him simply as the great parent of the universe. But we can also have a fervent relationship of faith in the great cloud of witnesses that make up Holy Mother Church. We can have discerned rationally, like Aristotle, the need for a first and final cause, an unmoved mover. But we may also have listened to wisdom literature that comes with an embedded claim of divine revelation. Through reason, through faith, we try to discern the true relation of the human to that which we call the divine. No one in their right mind thinks that you can choose to join a church because they have better fellowship or better liturgy. Like parents and country, God preexists us as a cause of our being, and our relation is a relation of discernment, not of choice. We discern the truest account of the divine. We discern the most fitting way of worship. Nation, family, and church. They're not perfect. They're real. This is the fundaments of natural law. This is what we find in George Washington's book, Cicero's On Duties, Duty to God, Father, and Country. Cicero, throughout the classical and Christian period, he's not a Christian, but he's a favorite author of the Christians throughout the Middle Ages. Cicero becomes the go-to man for a description of natural law. The law, the duties, the obligations that are embedded in our nature, which we can rationally discern. When Thomas Aquinas needs a handy-dandy little footnote for natural law definition, right? He doesn't go to the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary. He doesn't go to Webster's, right? Wiktionary, or whatever that's called, right? He goes to Cicero. He goes to Cicero de Inventione, Book 2, number 53. That's the sort of go-to point for natural law for Thomas Aquinas. Whenever he's like, yes, and as Cicero says in De Inventione, Book 2, number 53, justice is a habit of the mind that attributes its proper dignity to everything, preserving a due regard to the general welfare. Its first principles proceed from nature. Subsequently, some practices became established by universal custom from a consideration of their utility. Afterwards, the fear of the laws and religion sanctioned proceedings that originated in nature and have been approved of by custom. So natural law originates in nature, then is approved of by custom, and then becomes solidified in law and liturgy. Natural law is that which has not had its origin in the opinions of men, but has been implanted by some innate instinct, like religion, affection, gratitude, revenge, attention to one's superiors, and truth. I'm just going to read what he has to say about religion and affection, because in his description of the natural laws of religion and affection, he encompasses duties to God, Father, and country. Cicero says, religion is that which causes men to pay attention to and to respect with fixed ceremonies a certain superior nature, which men call divine nature. Affection is that feeling under the influence of which kindness and careful attention is paid to those who are united to us by ties of blood, or who are devoted to the service of their country. To God, father, and country are the highest obligations of natural law. Now, a young George Washington, in his 20s, already world famous in his 20s, coming back from the French and Indian War, where he had been fighting in the Virginia militia, marrying the wealthy heiress, Martha Custis, and inheriting from his half-brother, Mount Vernon, as he's setting up his first home. I hope all of you in the next 10 years will be in this position, right, where you're setting up your first home, right? Maybe you'll have your first fireplace and your first mantelpiece, and you have to decide what you're going to put on the mantelpiece, right? What art are you going to have in the bathroom, right? You're going to be starting to look at decor, right? What are you going to register for in your bridal registry, right? Start to the home, right? As George Washington settled in his 20s, young 20-year-old George Washington's already one of the tallest men in the colonies, statuesque, right? Before he became the largest obelisk on planet Earth, he was the tallest man in the colonies. Abigail Adams wrote to her husband and said that he seemed to her nothing short of a god. I'm not sure you're supposed to say to your short husband that when you first met George Washington, he struck you as a god, but that's not quite the way you should put it. So as he comes home from the war and he's setting up his first home with Martha at Mount Vernon, we know that he immediately sent off to London for a marble sculptural group of Pious Aeneas carrying his father, Anchises fleeing burning Troy with Asconius at his heels. We still have his receipt in his receipt books at Mount Vernon. They didn't burn the receipt books, just the personal letters, right? And so in the receipt books, we know that George Washington had this sculpture, right? This inner muscle, right, of pietas to God, Father, and country. I'm going to close with doing two sort of acrobatic leaps, right? One is to talk about the relationship of property to devotion to God, Father, and country. And then the other, a little bit more controversial even, if property is not controversial, I don't know if property is controversial for you. Is property controversial for you? Private property, pro, con, I don't know. How do you feel about private property? We have any socialists or communists in the audience here at our Constitution Day lecture? I'm not sure, but I don't know how you feel about property. But at any rate, property and repaying debts was very important to the American Constitution. We need a stronger government so that we could tax sufficiently, so that we could repay the public debt from the American Revolutionary War, which made us an independent republic rather than a banana republic, because banana republics don't repay their war debt, and so they're perennially in debt to some other country for their political freedom. So we'll talk about property for a moment, right? But then talk about slavery, right? Property had a particularly moral connotation for the generation of the American founders, for whom Cicero's De Officii, Cicero's On Duties, was the primary textbook of moral philosophy, both in Britain and in the American colonies. For that generation, property meant that you had the ability to fulfill your primary moral obligations to God, Father, and country. If you did not have enough property to support your family, if you could not take care of your dependents, meaning your elderly parents and your children, then you were not taking care of the little public that was the family, the first of the public entities, the first society that any man finds himself born into is the society of the family. And if you cannot sustain your family, elderly parents and young children, right, then you can't fulfill your primary moral obligation. You need property to take care of your family. If you do not have any property to be taxed for the public defense and public order, then you cannot take care of your primary responsibility to your nation, the creation of public order. So if you're not paying taxes on your property, then you are not fulfilling your obligation to your nation. And similarly, if you are not tithing to support public worship of the divine nature, right, in whatever form you have discerned is the proper public worship for the divine nature, right, if you are not giving money to any philanthropic cause, right, if you are not supporting any cult, any culture, any cultural activity whatsoever, right, any description of man's supreme good, whether it's beauty or justice or education, right, any worship of the divine, then you are not fulfilling your moral obligation to God, Father, and country. You need property. Like, we're body, soul unities, right? To fulfill moral obligations, we need property, right? Property was not selfish and commercial and individualistic. Property was necessary for sustaining the little republics, family, nation, church, that make up the republic. You couldn't be a public man if you had no property to sustain the little public of the family, the little public of the church, and the public of the nation. Which is why, I'm going to head right into the controversy, which is why the founding generation could not conceive of, quote unquote, freeing their slaves without giving them property. Because without property, you weren't free. Property freed you to be able to fulfill your moral obligations to God, Father, and country. It was not liberating to, as they said in 18th century parlance, cast someone on the public purse. If you were living on welfare and had no money to support your family, to tithe to support your church, or any other voluntary associations, 501c3s that you approve of, if you had no money to be taxed for the public defense and public order, then you were not free. You were a slave of the public. It didn't occur to them that you would do that to people. It seemed to them scandalous that you would, quote unquote, free someone and cast them penniless into the streets as a vagabond. And so George Washington, after he had realized the moral evil of the slave system into which he was born and which he himself had inherited, when he was 10 years old, he inherited slaves, land, and debt. As long as he had slaves, land, and debt, the land did not belong to him and the slaves did not belong to him. He was not in a legal position to free his slaves or to sell his land because it belonged to his creditors. I don't know if you have creditors. I imagine some of you are here on FAFSA funds. Do you take FAFSA funds at Belmont Abbey? We take FAFSA funds at the University of Dallas. Mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. We are not free people, right? Hillsdale's free, right? They don't take public money. Wyoming Catholic's free. They don't take public money, right? We are slaves of the American public. University of Dallas would shut down without tuition, and we wouldn't have any tuition. Our students wouldn't have any money for tuition if they didn't get federal loans. So we are slaves of the American public. We must do their bidding. And at any moment, they can just turn off the tap, and we will sink back into the dust of Texas from which we came and blow like the tumbleweed. Where was I? Right. When you have debt, whether it is national debt or whether it is personal debt, right? When you have debt, you are not free. And as long as George Washington had inherited land, slaves, and debt, he was not in a position to sell the land or to free the slaves. George Washington was the only one of the founding fathers born and raised within the slave system who extracted himself from the slave system in an honorable way. He worked over the course of 30 years to get himself out of debt. Again, I'm looking at a group of 20-year-olds. I have no idea if you have any conception of what that might mean. To work to get yourself out of debt. And this is not just personal debt. This is national debt and familial debt from several generations that you have inherited. Got to get out of tobacco. Tobacco's got you in a cycle of debt. Everybody who stays in tobacco, it's like a get-rich-quick scheme, right? But you're living on credit to your London creditors. You send off the tobacco, they send you the Pious Aeneas statue. You send off your tobacco, they send you more beautiful sculpture and paintings. You can't live like this forever, right? And manage to free your slaves. You got to get out of tobacco. George Washington diversified his crops. This might not sound exciting. I know diversification of crops does not sound super exciting on a Friday evening, right? Diversifying your income flow, right? Go into corn, wheat, cattle, lumber, fisheries on the Potomac, right? Diversify your crops. Get out of tobacco debt. Gradually save enough money so that you can get rid of the mortgage on your land. Get rid of the mortgage on Mount Vernon so that it's free of debt. So that at his death, in his will, he could not just free his slaves, he could give them an annual sum to support the elderly and the infirm and to educate the young in a craft that would enable them to support themselves. To give them a beginner's portion of property so that they would not just be politically free, liberated, but economically free, that they would have the beginnings of property that would enable them to support God, Father, and country, to be genuine members of the public, right? Not on the public purse, not on the public welfare, but upstanding, free citizens of the Republic. He gave them what was called an annuity, an annual sum out of the Washington estate. And the Mount Vernon estate was paying out to the former Washington slaves for 50 years after George Washington's death. After the death of Thomas Jefferson, who died in debt and had no possibility of freeing his slaves because they belonged to his creditors. After James Madison died in debt, right? Not his fault. He married Dolly Madison. Dolly Madison had a son who gambled, and all of James Madison's money was frittered away by Dolly Madison's spendthrift son. After James Madison had died, after John Adams had died, we're already moving into the period of Jacksonian democracy, and the Mount Vernon estate, the Washington estate, was still paying an annual annuity to help to support the elderly and the young get a standing in life, right? Get a position in life. Right? George Washington understood in a deeply personal way the relationship between our moral duties, property ownership, and what genuine freedom in a republic means. Thank you.
We'll take a few questions.
Sure.
Sure. All right. Thank you once again for that wonderful talk and for being with our students this afternoon. Okay. I think we have time for maybe one or two questions. We have to get Dr. Hansen and faculty off to dinner. But can I take one or two questions?
One or two questions. There's a question back there. Yes.
I'm going to put you on the live stream.
I'm already used to you. During the little Q&A we had this afternoon, little seminar we had this afternoon, I already got a good question from this gentleman. So I think we're in for a good question. Yes.
I'm not too sure about that, but just sort of what was said about the idea about owning property is sort of the way that you are able to be free, that is a necessary thing because it allows you to support your family, it allows you to support your way of life. That is essentially what is required for freedom. So would that mean that in the context of some of these more modern ideas of economics, such as socialism and communism, those nations make it inherently impossible to be free, as the ability to own private property is prohibited in a system like that? Or is there a possibility for freedom just through a different route?
Right. Thank you. That's an excellent question. Do socialism or communism, which nationalize all property or internationalize all property, internationalize all capital, and take it away from the individual person, individual persona, right, who has the intimate relationship with family, nation, and God. By taking away from them any property, are they inherently taking away their freedom to fulfill these moral obligations? And I think the answer is absolutely yes, which is why you see statist regimes, whether it's national socialism, which is fascism, right, or international socialism, which is communism, taking away the right of parents to decide how their children are educated, taking away the ability to support the church independent from the state, right? These are kind of the fundamental markers of a total statist regime, right? Is that there is no independent jurisdiction of the family, independent jurisdiction of the church, right? Even, right, refusal of the ability to teach your children what language you want to teach them. As I said, this is 1970s Chicago right here. 1970s Chicago, for anyone who doesn't know, is the second largest Polish city outside of Warsaw. Poles were not allowed to teach their children Polish under the Germans, under the Russians, right? Poles invented homeschooling, right, in order to teach Polish language, literature, poetry, culture, and religion to their children under the Nazi and the communist regimes. So definitely, I think that there's a kind of inherent conflict between those regimes and freedom properly understood. Yes. All right, another question.
One more, I think, yeah.
Oh, very good.
Thank you. I guess my question is a little more general. What do you think of the way the founders are portrayed in popular culture, especially with the popularity of musicals such as Hamilton or shows such as Turn on AMC that aired a few years ago? What do you think about those?
I try to avoid them as much as possible. I like to do things like looking through the bibliography of books that George Washington had in his actual library, or do play readings of Joseph Addison's 18th century play that gives you actually the mind of the founders. So I'm a deep nerd, but I say that with some pride because I'm sensing that Belmont Abbey students are also deep nerds. I have actually both listened to and watched a version of Hamilton, and so I wouldn't mind saying a word about that particular example. I can't speak to the others. And I think it's maybe appropriate to say a word about Hamilton's picture of our revolution, especially right now as we are in the midst of the death and the funeral preparations of Queen Elizabeth. The catchy song which George III sings in the musical Hamilton, which makes him look like such a twit. I'll leave it at twit because this is being recorded or something like that. So it makes him look like a twit, if you know what I mean. Gives the impression that the American Revolution was a revolution in favor of democracy against monarchy, when in fact, the American Revolution was a revolution in favor of a mixed regime, a balance of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy, against what had become an absolute government under the legislature, under parliament, and the king had become a mere figurehead. The king had increasingly become a mere figurehead, not a real political actor. The prime ministers, the leader of the majority party in parliament, were the primary actors. And today's Constitution Day, we might as well say, right, the Constitution does not use the word democracy, and the Federalists, in defending our Constitution, do not use the word democracy except to say what we want to avoid is an absolute democracy, right? We want to tame democracy with an independent executive, independent judiciary, and this federal system of state and federal government, right? They wanted to tame the democratic element, which they knew could very easily head towards anarchy and tyranny because they had read the classics, they had read the ancients, they'd read Solon, Aristotle, Cicero, Polybius, and they knew that democracies are dangerously unstable, and so they didn't give us a democracy. 1776 is not monarchy versus democracy. 1776 is centralized government against checks and balances, mixed government regime. Anyway, and so I think that's a very powerful moment in the play that deranges your entire vision of the 1776 moment. So beware. Buyers beware.
All right. Thank you once again. And
thank you. Good fun. So I gave that talk.